So James Bloodworth, journalist and author of Lost Boys, A Personal Journey Through the Manosphere. Welcome to the Prospect Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
In a way, this book is quite a brave book. Or the opening, at least to me, felt like quite a brave book because it takes us back to the early 2000s and to a weekend that you spent in London as a 23-year-old, I think, learning to be what's called a pickup artist. You paid a couple of £1,000s to be taught basically some quite, to our eyes now, quite sexist things and ways of approaching and talking to women. You imply in your writing that you sort of maybe try to forget that experience for a while and move on from it. So tell us, what made you revisit that experience and that story? What made you think it was time to tell it?
When I decided really to, with my editor at Atlantic, that I was going to write a book on the Manosphere, it sort of, one of the reasons I was reluctant to write the book at all, because I couldn't really revisit this subject. I couldn't really visit this subject without revisiting my own experiences with the pickup stuff, because that was part of the Manosphere. That is part of the Manosphere as well. So I sort of had to. It would have felt really dishonest to write a book about the Manosphere without revisiting that stuff. But it was also, that was by far the hardest stuff to write, because I had very much memory hold that experience as kind of an embarrassing, a piece of embarrassing kind of folly from my when I was young and stupid and stuff. Even though I would also say that there isn't really necessarily this clear demarcation between the Manosphere and the mainstream. It is kind of this spectrum, some of these like sexist beliefs. But yeah, I had to talk about that stuff. It was also a bit cathartic in a way, but that was easily the hardest bit of the book to write.
You write also in that first section in 2006 or towards the end, I was almost certainly sexist. And we were kind of wondering, at that time, you write, it's kind of lad culture, the 2000s in Britain. There's a sort of sexism in the culture. What did it mean to be sexist then? And can you kind of talk a little bit about that sexist lad culture that was around?
Yeah, I'd say the mainstream culture of the early 2000s. So I used to have a job in, when I was in college, I used to have a job in like a petrol station. And we used to have to sort the newspapers out every Sunday and stuff. And there would be certain newspapers like the Daily Star, the Sport, and the Sun, which is just kind of, it was just like incredibly like objectifying, to the point where you have kind of some of those newspapers, you have upskirt photos of like celebrities, these very like demeaning photos of women kind of splashed all over the paper, of women falling out of nightclubs and stuff. And there was just kind of, there were these, so the way, if you look even back at some of the TV from a slightly later period, like the In-Betweeners and stuff, the way they talk about girls in school or women, is like, that was kind of how we as boys, to some extent, used to talk, from what I remember, in like school, and not so much in college, but it was kind of, there was this just kind of view of women as kind of slightly different species in a way, like and also that stuff, that kind of point of view made it much easier for the pickup stuff about women being emotional, men being logical, all of these stereotypes, to kind of, you'd kind of let them slide more, or they'd kind of land, and you say, oh yeah, this must be kind of right because women are kind of different from us. And yeah, I'm not sure at that time. And also like the idealization of women as well, and the flip side of that being kind of the Madonna whore thing, where if a woman kind of slept around, if a man did it, it was fine, but if a woman did it, you'd have kind of a more lowly view of her. And I definitely had those views to some extent, but I don't think I don't think that bit of it was any more sexist than I think the mainstream was, at least mainstream men were at that time. I think my thing with the pickup is I was good at compartmentalizing things, where I would tell myself, and I think I deluded myself like that. I think I would tell myself that I could just learn some of these lines and stuff, like just like conversation starters, just learn to kind of put myself out there more, because that was the aspect of it I liked, that, if I work on my social skills, I can improve them, and it's not just kind of this fatalistic view that I'm just introverted or shy or whatever. And I thought I could compartmentalize that and separate it from the kind of the ideological side of the manosphere. And I did to an extent, but I don't think you can like completely. If you're kind of marinated in that world, you start to adopt some of the ideas that, you know, men should be dominant, women are naturally like passive, and, you know, men are logical, women are emotional. You start to kind of, there's like a drip of radicalization. Whereas I think if you stay around it for a long time, however much you think, however arrogant enough you are to think you've compartmentalized it and separated that, but you can't really, I don't think.
Yeah. For our listeners that aren't familiar, we should, before we get kind of too deep and trace the journey from there to here, maybe just describe a bit what this pickup scene was. So it's existing in this early 2000s lad culture, but it's kind of a specific like set of tips or rules about how to go about picking up women on nights out. And there are kind of, you know, you describe in the book some of these figures who are quite influential in kind of telling other guys, look, this is how you do it. Can you just describe for us like what that scene was back then?
So the pickup artist community, or the seduction community, as sometimes called, it was kind of a subculture of men who claimed to have turned the art of seduction into a science, basically like a step-by-step process that anybody, whatever how they looked or their income level or how tall they were or whatever, anyone could follow this step-by-step process and basically get a girlfriend, get a series of one-night stands, be more successful with women, essentially. And this subculture, these men would kind of gather on forums, internet forums, early like Usenet internet forums, and kind of share tips and techniques, and from everything from kind of, there was a lot of kind of prosaic, like relatively like mundane stuff on there. So you'd have, the forums will be full of what were called like newbies, like guys who just wanted like, oh, what aftershave shall I wear on a date, or how do I ask someone out, how do I approach this woman at work, or this woman at college or something. There was a lot of that, but then there were also these guru figures who were selling products and who kind of established themselves as authority figures, who had this very much like taxonomy of men and women, this like systematic view of sexual relations based in evolutionary psychology and like market economics, and yeah, it was very much, and they were selling courses on this, and the subculture kind of, yeah, it was very fringe, and then it became a bit more mainstream. It was kind of on the fringes of the mainstream after Neil Strauss, the journalist, published his book The Game in 2005. Then you would encounter people in the mainstream who knew about this stuff. And when I went to university, there were people like literally going out to bars and doing this stuff on campus nights and stuff like this. And that was kind of when I drifted away from it, because I was just going out more, and the forum stuff and all that seemed kind of corny. And yeah, over time, oh, this is pretty objectifying and kind of weird. And then kind of drifted away from it gradually.
And in the book, you start with this sort of pickup scene, and you trace this route through this like red pill Reddit kind of anti-feminism ideology through to kind of Andrew Tate of today. Obviously, this is your entire book, so I'm not asking you to summarize it in a minute or something, but can you just kind of explain for our listeners that trajectory? How do we get from this through to this to where we are now?
So in the 2010s, really, the pickup scene, it's become much bigger because of The Game. So The Game sold like 2 million copies, I think it was, and it was on the New York Times bestseller list for a while. And the subculture kind of grew, and so you had all these new gurus who basically marketed themselves as pickup teachers and stuff, because it was really easy to do that. All you had to do is make these like outlandish promises, be good at marketing, and then they take guys out and just point at women in a nightclub and say, go and approach them. It wasn't like a hard skill set to have or purport to have. And so you had the subculture grew. And then in the 2010s, you have the rise of platforms like YouTube, which is slightly before 2010, but the 2010s, YouTube, and then later on Instagram and like video-based social media, you have a lot more kind of gurus emerging with a kind of political stance, with a conspiratorial stance, who on the one hand, they tap into some of the insecurities generated by video-based social media, by dating apps, by people feeling like they're not enough in that kind of photogenic, photo-based, video-based world. But you also see the pickup scene kind of changing, where it becomes much more about entertaining the viewers rather than teaching them anything. So the videos on YouTube that get the most hits from the pickup companies are videos that rant about feminism, videos that basically made at women's expense. And some of the companies start to realize that this generates more traffic than actually, like, men are coming to view these videos, this content, not because they actually want to have tips to get a girlfriend necessarily, but because they kind of enjoy hearing women belittled, hearing kind of feminism slagged off, and much of this stuff. And so that's kind of part of it. It becomes much more political, much more conspiratorial. And the algorithms later on start to fuel the radicalization in a way that didn't really happen didn't really happen when I found these forums, where there wasn't really an algorithm which would send you down this information silo. Whereas with YouTube, the algorithm changes in the 2010s, and it becomes much more easier to fall down these kind of rabbit holes of more politicized red pill content, where it's very much, it's not about picking up women and meeting women anymore. It's about the problems in the world are the fault of women, and getting back at women in some kind of cosmic way, because society's gone to shit because of feminism. That's what they would say. And I think also during the 2010s, there's a lot of structural things happening. So we have the aftermath of the 2008 economic recession and global economic recession, where you have global economic crisis, I mean to say, but where you have kind of these men whose lives aren't necessarily turning out as they hoped they would in the 2010s. And then you have these kind of guru figures come along and say, well, that's because women and minorities are hoarding all the treasure. So it becomes a much more kind of, the ground is much more ready for that kind of demagogic, populist, backlash style pitch from some of these gurus who are emerging then.
Just for the sake of our listeners who don't know the terminology, can you just quickly explain what red pill means?
Sure. So the idea of the red pill is taken from the film The Matrix, and in the film you have the blue pill, which is considered the state of kind of blissful ignorance. You can take the blue pill and you can go through society just kind of remaining kind of blissfully ignorant of what's really controlling society. Whereas if you take the red pill in The Matrix, you become aware of the truth that you're actually living in a computer simulation. And the red pill is applied to the manosphere is the idea that women basically can run the world and men exist under the boot of feminism, essentially. Whereas the blue pill, most men are considered blue-pilled. They go around and kind of swallow the myths about that feminism puts out there about men being oppressors, women being oppressed. Whereas the red pill, the men who claim to have taken the red pill, that's the idea that they've become cognizant of the truth, whereas the men are actually oppressed by women. A gynocentric society, basically.
You talk there about some really, massive structural changes that we all experienced collectively in recent decades. You talk about kind of the financial crisis, obviously social media, and how that's kind of changed our information world and what we see. I wonder if we could kind of dig into a bit more why you think men end up in this kind of radicalized worldview now. People talk about sometimes a backlash against big social changes, kind of crisis of masculinity based on men losing their place in society. Do you think that's right? Is that kind of the root cause of why men end up in this world, or is it something else?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely part of it. I mean, there's a sense in which men have lost status relative to women in some areas, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I mean, that's mainly because men kind of had that economic superiority before, as an example, which that gap has been reduced. But you also have sort of gendered expectations which still lag behind some of those social changes. So men, there is still kind of expectations. Like men were considered, as the Manosphere guys would put it, providers and protectors. Men need to be providers and protectors. And that gendered expectation, I think, is still there to some extent, at least in a residual sense for lots of men. Whereas the actual material role has diminished a lot. So it's not really, women often don't need when they're looking for a partner, they're not just looking for a provider for a paycheck or something anymore. And that requires kind of a period of adjustment from a lot of men to kind of, what are they bringing to the table that's not, not just a paycheck. And it's the same with like strength. Physical strength is not rewarded in the economy or by a partner in the same way that it was in the past, certainly in say the working class. And that was kind of what my last book looked at. That kind of brute strength isn't really as valuable in the economy as it was in the past. So there is kind of that kind of material reality shifted, but some of those gendered expectations are still kind of there. So there is that pressure, even the way that, so incel is a specific subculture in the manosphere that stands for involuntary celibates. But there's also the way incel is used as an insult at men who are considered like sexless men who are unattractive, are branded incel and virgin. And it's still a term of insult to be a man who doesn't have a sexual partner, in the same, or in a similar way, in a comparable way to how women are still seen, if they're seen as like too promiscuous, it's seen as something really negative about them. For men, there's still that kind of there's something negative if you're seen as some kind of failure if you don't have a sexual partner, or if you don't have the ability to find a sexual partner. There's still that attachment to having a woman as like a status object that still very much like permeates society. Whereas it's hard, men can no longer just do that with, say, bringing a paycheck to the table. So I think a lot of the cultured expectations, there are kind of mixed messages sometimes. Whereas we make a lot of progress towards equality materially in many ways, but there's also, if you look at some aspects of popular culture, it's gone the other way in terms of men. So you have what's the ideal physique for a man now? It's much more buff and muscular than it was when I was younger. So you can see that stereotype's become more rigid. If you look at the film, like Chris Hemsworth or something, the action heroes in films now, the ideal is much more this cartoonist version of masculinity than it was when I was younger. So there's sometimes mixed messages, I think, which can lead some men into the manosphere. It's quite a complex question. But then if you look at like gym and boys taking anabolic steroids, there's much more of that now. So one part of the culture is going the other way towards these very rigid stereotypes, whilst the other aspects moving towards a more egalitarian realm.
And arguably, a lot of those stereotypes are kind of feeding something that it's almost like feeding the male gaze rather than the female gaze, right? It's men are kind of becoming, this idea that men need to be really kind of muscular and like kind of strong is not necessarily something that women are asking for, but men are telling themselves on the internet that women want that of men.
Yeah, although I would say I would say it's not men as a collective saying that. It's usually men for profit or corporations for profit make men feel like they aren't enough as they are, or these kind of masculinity entrepreneurs. They create the sense of the feeling of insecurity in a similar way to companies have done that with women with cosmetics and they're not enough as they are. They have to modify themselves. It's very similar to that. It's like an expansion of the market to men by making them feel insecure about these things.
And the book is kind of like, filled with these kind of figures who are making money out of kind of capitalizing on men's vulnerabilities, insecurities, and there's kind of like a lot of grifters basically in the book, which I think is really interesting. I think social media, which you mentioned, plays a big part in kind of allowing them to make a sort of business out of this. And in recent years, maybe the kind of epitome of the ultimate figure who's made a business, a life out of this is Andrew Tate. Us in the media, we love to talk about Andrew Tate as kind of being synonymous with the manosphere today and the idea that men are kind of being radicalized in misogyny. What role do you think he's played as an individual? And is he actually really important? Is he the person who we should be talking about and seeking to understand this kind of bigger trend?
Yeah, I mean, he has played a big role in terms of around 2022, even before that. So I first became aware of him, I think, about 2019 when I was researching the book. I hadn't been researching it long, but he was quite a peripheral figure then, but was picking up. You could see he was starting to pick up a following on Twitter by just making these very unvarnished, outlandish statements about women, but also just about all kinds of stuff. And it was very kind of there was very much this kind of populist stick of discrediting the mainstream and then presenting this alternative reality, selling this alternative reality to audiences. And the big thing with people like Tate, I think, is the way, not just Tate, but Tate is a good example because he's very charismatic. He's very much like some of those populist figures like Donald Trump, who you may hate in society, liberal society may despise, but they still talk about them nonstop. Because they have this very telegenic charisma, which unfortunately cut through already in the age of television, but cuts through even more now, where a growing percentage of people consume their news from 30-second pieces of video content. So there's that aspect of him. He embodies the kind of stereotypes that have become more attractive in those men's spaces, that he's very muscular, he does combat sports, or has done combat sports. And he also knows how to use social media to present the lifestyle. So very much the package with Tate is also the lifestyle. So the video platforms like Instagram. So these kind of confidence men, these hucksters, these entrepreneurs in the past would have been, in the back pages of a men's magazine or something with their get rich quick schemes, like selling their magic beans. But now they kind of sit in front of a infinity pool or a mansion, and if you watch his content, it's all private jets, luxury restaurants, and always surrounded by this kind of harem of women in bikinis or whatever as the kind of that status object. So for a teenage boy, this kind of fantasy, but presented as, maybe when you're 13, it's harder to distinguish between what's real and what's rented, or what's real and what's just kind of an illusion. That's a huge part of the appeal, because it also circumvents the socialization of parents and progressive teachers or whatever, because it's going straight through to a device on their phone. And this person seems cooler than, I don't know, Mr. Briggs, the 40-year-old science teacher or something. This person seems like, well, I want to have a lifestyle like this. And you also see boys, especially in some of the boys I met in the US, will kind of drop out of college and say, oh, I'm not going to go to college, because they're listening to people like Tate, which is a really potentially damaging for their own futures as well, because they believe these get rich quick schemes. And social media has played a huge role in that. And I think Tate has as well, because he's just more compelling as a personality than a lot of these other manosphere figures, who can be quite stilted and quite like the behaviors they're displaying are kind of is like a mask, whereas Tate, he has that kind of force multiplier of conviction, I think I call it somewhere in the book, which is a danger in a visual society. And we see that with politics as well. These figures who make great headway on TikTok or something, but they're not actually, they're game show hosts or whatever, rather than people we actually want having any kind of power or authority in society.
You talk about in the book the kind of Andrew Tates of the world, how they overlap with the Nick Fuentes of the world. And one of the ways that there is this overlap between the far right and the manosphere is with anti-Semitism, for example, as well as regressive attitudes towards women. Do you see any overlaps kind of on the left? Do you see kind of progressive men or men further to the left who are kind of in the manosphere, or any overlaps with those sorts of, with influencers over there somewhere on the political spectrum, or is that not really a trend at all?
I wouldn't say, I'd say it could be overlapping. There could be an overlap in the sense that I think sometimes on the left or among progressives, and this could apply to anti-Semitism or misogyny, because I think during kind of the Corbyn era of the Labour Party, there were issues around anti-Semitism then, and some of that is this kind of unexamined, not probably interrogating yourself, not probably taking your own temperature on some of these issues, and not interrogating your own beliefs on it. And I think sometimes on the left, you can think you have those things solved. You're a progressive, you're a good person. You don't have to necessarily examine your own views around some of these issues. Whether it's, you may be the ideal male feminist in the sort of stuff you're espousing, but maybe the better feminist, I think, probably is the person who actually behaves better in their personal relationships than just kind of spouts the correct, doctrines or whatever. I think sometimes on the left, there is that tendency to, mouth the platitudes or the doctrines or the correct language, instead of actually interrogating your own behaviors and stuff. And I think that can absolutely apply to anti-Semitism as well, like tracing your own prejudices, taking your own temperature on how you actually, if you feel some prejudicial urge or something, interrogating where that comes from and stuff. And I think some parts of the left can be unreflective on those things. I wouldn't say it's worse than the right at all. I'd say the right is obviously worse, I think. But yeah, not thinking you've got those things solved. We're obviously the community of the good because we're on the left and we don't need to examine our own behaviors necessarily.
When you, in the process of your reporting, were meeting some young men who are, you're perhaps feeling similarly to how you felt when you were in your early 20s, kind of looking for answers, finding comfort in this manosphere. What was that like for you, kind of re-encountering that world? And how did you feel when you related to these young men? Did you empathize with them? Did you think they should be making better choices? Talk us through that process for you, kind of encountering that world again.
It was quite discombobulating and anxiety inducing in some ways. Sometimes I wasn't sure why at first, because sometimes you can have an anxiety but not really sure the precise source of it. It was more depressing, and partly that was because I think I was more alert. I was kind of more switched on and listening to what people were saying, because when I was there originally, I was obviously stuck in my own head to a certain extent. And while I was observing everything, I didn't really understand the meaning of all the things I was hearing fully. But it also seemed darker when I went back. So there were, again, it was much more politicized. So I would hear conversations where it would slip into this very like essentialist view of women, where it's like women should be in the kitchen. Women, like, really, people just straight out saying women should be in the kitchen, or women should do these servant roles, play these servant roles, because then they're in touch with their feminine energy. And like, I'd never heard that when I was from the pickup stuff. It was very much like pros. Yeah, there was this undercurrent of sexism and this very reductive view of men and women, but it was also very much concerned with just like, oh, what works, like what's gonna get my foot in the door in this conversation. There wasn't really the same level of resentment generally from some of those guru figures. There was this much more darker energy. Is probably how I'd put it later on when I went back in the scene, and that was that was uncomfortable. And then you'd hear more anti-Semitism, racism, things like that. Racism in certain company, because it wasn't all like white people on these courses. It was very much a mixed group, but you still hear kind of racialized attitudes more, and misogyny. It was all kind of bound in together a bit more. Whereas that wasn't really something I noticed. I mean, I'm sure it was there to some extent, but back in the 2000s when I'd encountered the scene, but it wasn't as much as it was later on. It got that aspect. It definitely got worse.
It strikes me hearing you talking, what kind of reflecting before on what kind of the sexism of the 2000s, and then talking now about the sort of very similar sexism you encountered meeting these young men, but the kind of the darker political kind of environment that it's in, that there's ultimately the kind of the basic sort of strand of misogyny is very much the same. It hasn't really changed. And, you know, we talked about Andrew Tate before. There's been various sort of policy ideas to deal with this. Labour had suggested they would promote positive male role models in schools to counter Andrew Tate. I mean, this isn't exactly a policy recommendations book, but, you know, you've been thinking about this really deeply. Do you think there's anything that can be done to try to mitigate some of these really horrendous beliefs that young men are now growing up into again in a kind of new generation?
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of difficult path to tread between, you know, don't want a moral panic. I don't think that we have had a moral panic. Maybe when Keir Starmer suggested watching adolescents in schools, that's straying onto that territory a bit. But then we also need to recognize that a lot of the Manosphere ideas have seeped into the mainstream. I think there is that's a huge thing I noticed. Probably the biggest thing I noticed over the course of writing the book, or over the course of the 20 years, that many of these ideas are fairly well accepted in the mainstream now. So I think it's 83% of 13 to 15-year-old boys have heard of Andrew Tate, and a quarter have a positive view of him. You also have a majority of that age group think that the women are only interested in a small cohort of men. So that's the 80-20 rule that well, it's not just 80%, they believe all women are interested in just 20% of men. That's a typical manosphere idea. That's become more mainstream among a younger cohort of men. And also that age group tend to be Gen Z, tend to be more, see feminism in a more negative light than millennials and Gen X do. I mean, there's some stats from a few years ago on that. So I definitely think that's an example of the manosphere becoming more mainstream. I mean, in the US, Roe versus Wade, the overturning of that. J.D. Vance, the vice president, has described himself as red-pilled, and he's now the vice president. And you have many people among the Republicans gunning for now no-fault divorce. And again, that's a very much a red pill talking point, that things like no-fault divorce have created this disaster where you have all these surplus men who can't automatically find a willing female partner. So it has become more mainstream. There are different, I mean, there's been a conversation about banning social media or phones from young people. I definitely do think there's an argument for banning social media from teenage boys, for example, or teenagers, because it just circumvents socialization. I mean, it circumvents the socialization, however good, from parents or teachers, and you allow kind of teenagers to be sucked into this sales funnel, which is what the manosphere really is now. It's this sales funnel where these very compelling, very media savvy, very charismatic masculinity entrepreneurs make men feel like shit and then say, but if you buy my course, if you buy my £5,000 course or whatever, I will fix you and I will turn you into one of these 20% high status alpha males. So I think you can't really have the conversation about why the manosphere has started to gain more traction without talking about, well, should the internet just be a free for all where kids can go and just like watch these like incredibly toxic videos? It's a form of advertising. Do we think advertising works or not? And if we ban junk food ads for children, why do we allow some of these very toxic masculinity influencers to just have free reign over children? I think that's definitely a question worth asking. The role models thing is difficult because I do think on a micro level, male role models can be good. I mean, I don't write about this in the book because it would have felt slightly unfair to my mum in some ways to go into it too much. Like, I didn't have a dad in like present growing up and stuff, and it definitely had an effect, and I still kind of am figuring out exactly what that was in some ways. But it was also better than having like a bad father present. So it was better than having an abusive father or a bad father present to grow up, just with my mum and my gran, basically. So role models, it's a double-sided thing. More male school teachers, I think can be valuable. I had a really good male teacher in college, and not that I didn't have good female teachers. It's just a different kind of dynamic sometimes that I felt both were useful. And having a really good male teacher in college, whereas in school the women teachers were better, it just did make a difference. It did make me feel like, I can. Like academic stuff can be like a male thing as well. And being a sociology teacher, this stuff can be something I can kind of pursue further, like in that kind of role model, someone to identify with a bit, I guess. But also role models. Andrew Tate's also a role model. So I think uncritically venerating these kind of celebrity influencer role models isn't automatically a good thing. I think teaching critical thinking, teaching kind of, it's about how you think, not what you think necessarily that's important. And not just kind of falling into this trap of believing what someone says because they have clout and social proof on social media, or that because they're experts in one topic, they're therefore experts in another topic. I think that kind of role model can be quite negative as well.
So if you were that teacher or that parent who's trying to kind of make an intervention and break that circuit or that funnel of information that young men are exposed to, what would be the advice that you would give to a young man who's maybe feeling unsure of their place, maybe looking for meaning and connection? What would you say to them?
I mean, just kind of chill out, really. It's not, you don't need to wear this costume. It's not as difficult to make a connection as you think it is, basically. I mean, a lot of this stuff is men putting up these walls between themselves and other people, and women in particular, but also just people in general, and wearing this costume, this very cartoonish, rigid costume, because they think they've they've imbibed the belief that that's what they need to do to be successful. And in some aspects, like in the economic realm, especially in America, you sort of do need to adopt that a bit, that kind of entrepreneurial, sharp-elbowed spirit. But I think in Europe, at least, and definitely in like the relationship sense, that's going to damage you. That's going to do more harm. You're going to blow relationships by turning into this kind of husk of masculinity. I mean, you don't need to work that hard. You just need to kind of chill out a bit and be vulnerable, like being vulnerable and open with people, and listening is more important than what you say. I think with making connections with people, that's kind of the paradoxical thing about a lot of that stuff. People will think you're a great conversationalist the more you listen to them. So things like that, not being so solipsistic and wrapped up in your own thing, and realizing that people probably don't care as much about you. They probably shouldn't say this, but people probably don't care as much about you, what you're doing, as you think they do when you're a teenager. Because when you grow up, you realize that when you grow up a bit, you realize that people weren't kind of scrutinizing every aspect of your behavior, and it was actually fine to just be chill and just be yourself.
That's the big secret to life that you've just let all the listeners in on, I think.
Yeah, damn, my secret's but that's kind of how I'd sum it up. It's obviously difficult. I mean, when you're a teenager especially, it's you tend to ruminate on this stuff a lot, and it feels like the entire world is scrutinizing you. I think that's partly an after effect of school, where everyone sort of is scrutinizing you.
James, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
This interview was from an episode of the Prospect podcast. To listen to the episode in full, including further discussion and our weekly banger and dud section, click the link in the description below. And to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, head to prospectmagazine.co.uk.